Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here today. I would like to personally thank His Excellency Sanchez Sorondo and, of course, Professor Archer. I'm a personal admirer for many years, and this is my third visit at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. It's very inspiring to be part of this effort, and I'm very thankful to Professor Archer for showing us the journey we've all taken in the last few years in these joint efforts. Recently, we marked the 11th EU Anti-Trafficking Day, and I want to start by reminding ourselves that trafficking doesn't appear to have decreased 11 years after we started marking this day. We're here today because someone in this moment, right now, in this city, less than a kilometer away, is buying a Nigerian girl trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. I think Sister Bonetti can verify that. We're here because there are Romanian women in Sicily trafficked for labor exploitation, and at the same time, they are victims of sexual exploitation. Because these cases happen every day. Recently, we have the so-called Manolada case in Greece involving 42 Bangladeshi men who were found to be victims of trafficking for labor exploitation. What is less known is that there were also Romanian, Bulgarian, Roma women trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation in the same place. Today's event places victims at its core, and this is indeed the way that the EU places the legal and policy framework. And we need to use this context. We need to remember that under the law, trafficking is a violation of human rights. It's prohibited in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. But at the same time, it's a form of very severe organized crime driven by demand and by astronomical profits. And I want to say a little bit about that. Let's just do a little bit of maths before anything else. I'm not very good, but I'll read the numbers to you. The International Organization on Migration in Italy says that only in 2016, 80% of the 11,000 Nigerian women and girls that arrived to Italy were presumed to be victims of sexual exploitation. 80% is 9,000 women and girls. Now, let's do a very, 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 very conservative estimate. And let's say that each abuser gets 15 euro, pays 15 euro for the abuse. Actually, it's about 30 euro. In the Netherlands, it's as high as 90 euro. And let's just say that it's only 5 abusers a day. Sister Bonetti told me before that in some cases it's 13 clients, she calls them, in an evening. I call them abusers. So if we calculate this money, this is 236 million euro per year. This is only for one nationality, one gender, one form of exploitation. When it comes to all forms, when it comes to all nationalities, men and women and children, it's billions. This we need to remember. The EU has done a lot to protect, to prosecute, and to prevent the crime, to protect the victims, to prosecute the traffickers. This is stipulated in the law, the so-called EU Anti-Trafficking Directive, so the EU law, and in its policy framework, which I have been responsible to implement. We also need to remember that the EU is the largest humanitarian donor in the world, so our funding is generous to protect the victims. But let me just go in another direction now. When it comes to the global level, the EU continues to embed trafficking in all dialogues, partnerships, in agreements, in all processes with non-EU countries. What is important, and I'd like to plead with you today, is to remember that we have the Palermo Protocol that is very clear on trafficking globally, and this is what we need to stick with. We have come a long way in the last 5 years, especially since the EU law was adopted. However, a lot more needs to be done. Our report from last year, that I was responsible to draft for the European Commission, finds that out of all the registered victims, 2/3 were EU citizens. This is important. 76% are women and girls, and 35% are from non-EU countries. Trafficking for sexual exploitation, with 67%, is the most prevalent form. exclusively affecting women and girls. Children represented only 15% of the registered victims. Why do I say only? Because we all know that the big challenge is to identify the victims. First, we have to find them, then we have to help them. So when it comes to victims, which is the topic of today, we need to ensure that all victims are treated as rights holders. Victims have rights in the EU. We have put together a list of their rights that come under 17 pieces of EU law. They have rights that are translated into 23 languages, but they're not necessarily accessible to them. They don't know they have these rights. Our job next has to make these rights accessible. And our first job has to be to identify those victims. What we suffer from in the EU, what we identify in our reports, is that we have a lot of challenge in ensuring early identification of victims. A lot of children, a lot of adults get lost in the process without ever being identified. And we also know that identification is a big challenge when it comes to the mixed migration flows that we're witnessing. Victims of trafficking are particularly vulnerable in the EU asylum acquis. They are undetected, including in the hotspots. We know that the migration challenges are exacerbating vulnerabilities. We know that trafficking networks are taking advantage of irregular migration routes. And I want to go back to the International Organization on Migration. They report 600% increase in the numbers of victims arriving to Italy since 2014, especially from Nigeria. 600% increase in 3 years. Having said that, it is still the case that the majority of victims in the EU are EU nationals, from Romania, from Bulgaria, from the Netherlands, from Hungary, and from Poland. I will come back to why we think this is happening. But here I want to point to something that Professor Archer said very clearly in the beginning. We need to ensure conceptual clarity. Trafficking and migrant smuggling are interlinked. This is very clear. Trafficking is linked with many other crimes, with document fraud, with terrorism, with corruption. We know that. But they are different things. We cannot use different terms, the same terms to describe different phenomena. We cannot just say, oh, it's a bit of forced labor, it's exploitation, it's slavery, it's modern slavery, it's trafficking, it's smuggling. We cannot do that. We cannot do that because it has implications. It has implications for victims, it has implications for states, it had implications for the measures that we can take in order to protect the people. We cannot use terms without legal qualification because it is the law that will protect the people. So we see a tendency to use trafficking and modern slavery. Now, we say modern slavery embraces all of these terms, but yet we say human trafficking and modern slavery. Of course, it's a very useful term, but there is no legal definition, and we have excellent law at the UN level with the Palermo Protocol and in the EU with our directive. The consequences with not using the law are real for the victims. For us, it could be politics, but for the victims, they have detrimental effects. The same with numbers. We cannot just arbitrarily use estimates. We estimate this, we estimate that. What is it? This is not a supermarket, this is people. And there are people who, Professor Archer doesn't like the word survivors, who used to be victims of trafficking or who were forced into providing services against their will, and they're in this room. They know very well. They know very well that we're talking about real numbers of people. I would ask you not to sensationalize with numbers. We need to know what we're counting. And to know what we're counting, we need to have the law and legal definitions. Otherwise, we're just sensationalizing for political purposes. In this context, I also want to plea for the need to ensure that we promote and progress with Agenda 2030. I'm very thankful to Professor Archer for already mentioning the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 8.7. I would like to remind everyone that there is also, if we're here to discuss human trafficking, Sustainable Goal 16.2 and Sustainable Goal 5.2 that relate to women trafficking and child trafficking. Last time I checked, they represented 2/3 of the victims of trafficking. If we start with a hierarchy of the Sustainable Development Goals, then we continue as a consequence with a hierarchy of victims. And it is not our place to place a hierarchy of victims. Our objective must remain to have no victims to identify or protect. At the end of the day, we need to follow the money, and we need to ensure that traffickers and those who profit from the exploitation of the victims are brought to justice. What does that mean concretely? Let us think about the case of the children, the girls trafficked for sexual exploitation in the EU. I would like to ask you this question. Who profits or benefits from the exploitation? How are these women recruited? How do they reach their destination? Behind every victim, there is a trafficker and there is an abuser. Trafficking doesn't happen in vacuum. It happens because there are people behind it, because there's money and there's demand behind it. And if we continue to talk about victims without talking about perpetrators, what we are doing is that we become part of a culture of impunity. And sometimes people say, oh, but it's very hard to prove and so on. You know, 20 years ago, I was part of efforts in my country, in Cyprus, a tiny little place, where they were trying to say, oh, you cannot prove rape now. We're not going to have legislation. Now we know otherwise. Now we're having the same discussions about trafficking, a huge crime. Behind every victim, there is not only a trafficker, there's an abuser, an exploiter, someone soliciting the services of these victims. And we cannot say that poverty, inequality, conflicts create human trafficking. Poverty in itself is poverty. It's a horrifying phenomenon, but in itself, it doesn't cause trafficking. It makes people vulnerable, that is true. But to have a 12-year-old Nigerian girl in the streets of Rome that is poor is a 12-year-old in the street that is poor. What makes it trafficking is that somebody profits from the exploitation, billions of euros, and somebody rapes the child. And that somebody could be 10 or 20 or 30 people a day. In the same time, we need responsibility for individuals and consumers. People buying tomatoes, potatoes, clothes, the designer bags in the streets of Rome. The EU law says that member states have a legal obligation to discourage the demand and raise awareness. We published a report on that, the so-called Users Report, and what we find is that the different legal approaches in the member states fail to effectively contribute to discourage the demand for the services of all forms of victims of trafficking. Today, it is not illegal in many countries in Europe to buy or use the services of victims of trafficking with the knowledge that the victim is a crime. On my way here from the metro, I came in the metro, and I walked for 10 minutes. And I saw a lot of little designer bags. And I knew that if I got one, I could be caught because there's a law against it. It's not the same when you buy people in the street, for some countries, for the crime of human trafficking. So what we're doing now is we're drawing important conclusions from the report we drafted, and we're examining all options, including legislative proposals. Commissioner Avramopoulos, to close, on migration and home affairs in the EU, spoke about renewed EU commitment to enhance efforts to eradicate the crime, and called on all authorities and stakeholders to strengthen their work on prevention, to untangle this complex supply chain. I'm very pleased to announce that, as anticipated by the Commissioner, we will shortly publish further EU policy priorities, a further policy framework, in order to also complement the EU law. We have strong legislation, we have strong policies, and we have funding. What we do not have is implementation. And what we don't need is new terms and ways of catching attention. We have everything. So I want to stop by asking you again, and I hope in the next 3 days this will guide the discussion. The victims are at the front, but at the back, There's someone who profits, who benefits from the exploitation, especially children. What are we doing to sufficiently target them, the criminals, the users, the profit makers? Who buys victims? Really? Who buys the services of victims? And how do these profits fuel further the supply and the demand for the use of the service of the victims, of the services of the victims? It is only when we seriously consider these questions and we live up to our legal obligations, because these are legal obligations, that we stand a chance to prevent the crime. We need to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. I'm a very keen fan of Professor Archer for many years, and I read her work. And in one of her papers, she discusses this issue of social death and what happens to victims. And having spoken to victims and having worked with some of them and having worked in this area for a long time, I really and genuinely think that the best thing that we can do for the victims is prevent the phenomenon from happening in the first place. Because once a child is raped 1,000 times, talking about saving the child is only about feeling good to save our own souls. And we all have children, and I think we can think about these things. I think we need to prevent it. And to prevent it, we must understand this is a crime. We need to stop the profits, and we need to stop the demand for all forms of exploitation. We need to understand there's no hierarchy of victims, no hierarchy of terms. There are legal terms to use, and we should use them. Thank you.